try to say a few words what can be used, from our lessons can be used in the Middle East, in the Arab world. I remember that in the first night of student protest in Albania in 1990, 23 years ago, I was in the meeting of students with the last communist president, Remzi, and the first thing they asked was free press. Actually, they are quite confused in their demands, but one thing was clear: we want free press. And actually, this was the first thing we achieved in Albania, and maybe the biggest thing we achieved in Albania, seen from the perspective of 23 years, and not only in Albania, but in all our region. And I am not surprised that the freedom of press is the first thing that our colleagues in the Arab world has achieved. After more than 20 years in Albania and in the Balkans, we have vibrant, vivid, overcrowded, chaotic, defragmented, non-transparent, and generally free media schemes. A bit long and a very complex transition. There are two questions I can put: what went right and what went wrong? On the positive side, I think we have to mention that in all the region we have pluralistic media schemes, systems. We have good legislative framework for the media. For example, the Balkans is the region where the trend towards defamation, towards the decriminalization of defamation is the strongest in the world, and actually laws are better than in Western Europe. We have an increasing role of media as a watchdog. If you are Prime Minister, President, politician in my country, you cannot sleep well. And this is good. You cannot sleep well, first of all, because of media. They are following you, they are behind. We have good laws and some good practices in access to information. And again, the strongest trend worldwide in access to information is in the Balkans, and 3 of our countries are among the 10 best performers in the world. And freedom of expression is recognized as a non-negotiable value of our democracy. So far, so good. But this is only part of the story. On the negative side, I think we have to mention the failure to build public media. The so-called public televisions basically looks more like ministries of propaganda. The failure to build functional media markets. And on the other hand, strong clientelism, partisanship, polarization, and in the end, very divided media schemes. To cut it short, a failure of independence. So I describe media in the Balkans as free but not independent, or as pluralistic but not independent. Where we are. Yesterday was mentioned the transition from euphoria to disappointment. In the media, we have seen the transition from censorship to self-censorship. Of course, there are no more red lines of the past, but there are gray lines of today where you have to have some self-control because the owner will fire you and because of many reasons. We shifted also from repression to pressure. Sounds better in Spanish, represión and presión. So there is no repression in the Balkans. There are no journalists in jail. There is one case in Macedonia, but there are no journalists beaten and attacked. But the pressure is so strong, and the pressure is invisible and is financial and more than that. We also shifted from control to influence. For countries moving towards European Union, control is too much. It's also counterproductive. Influence is more elegant. And politicians and business people have found ways to influence media in our region. And fourth, we shifted from state media sector monopoly to a private media sector monopoly. So from the dictate of the state to the dictate of the private. We failed building what is called public media again. Media in the Balkans is sandwiched very much between business and politics, and we have an unsacred, unholy alliance of media, business, and politics, actually. Ownership is unclear. We don't know who owns what, and actually we don't know also who pays whom, and we don't know who owns the owners. So this is quite opaque, this. And another tendency which I would like to mention is that in the Balkans you can speak as much you want, but generally no one cares. So we have the right to speak, but we don't have the right to be listened. What can we tell to our Middle East colleagues? I'm not sure what, but I will try. First, we have to mention some differences. 25 years ago, in our region, we had system change. In the Middle East, I believe we have regime change. So we had revolutions, which were negotiated revolutions, but anyway were revolutions which changed the system. What we have in the Middle East, I don't want to go to the debate of the previous sections. We have a mixture of revolutions, revolts, uprisings, reforms, coups, and I don't know what else. As Pavel mentioned, we don't have the religious factor present in our countries. But we also didn't have 25 years ago the social media factor, which is an important factor from the Middle East. Lessons learned and not to repeat, I think, first is avoid copy-paste approach when you do your legislation. 22 years ago, Albania did the first law, media law. And it was a copy-paste of the law of Westphalia in Germany, democratic country. And the law said that the fines have to be between 20,000 marks and 50,000 marks. In that time, a salary of Albanian journalist was 20 marks, and the salary of Albanian president was 200 marks. So we just copied even figures, and the law became very restrictive. So do your laws, of course, referring to the international standards. I think also it's good to avoid the mystification of democratic approach when we talk on the media. Usually we talk for media as a pillar of democracy, that's fine, but we forgot that media is also an industry of capitalism, a sector of capitalism. We don't talk for media markets. We talk only for media as one of the freedoms. And what is the result? That now in the Balkans, journalists are missionaries of democracy in one hand, and proletarians of capitalism on the other hand, who can be fired with an SMS and paid very badly. So, and we fail to have functional markets in our countries, so it's important also to focus on market rules. Third, I think it's important to have a critical approach when it comes to foreign assistance. I can imagine how many media experts are now in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, I have been also myself in Yemen. We tried to reform a few years ago the Media Institute, government-controlled in Yemen, based on the model of Media Institute in Tirana or in Sarajevo. And we failed miserably. It was the project supported by Denmark and Holland. Simply because what did work in Tirana not necessarily can work in Sana'a. And not because we are better or they are worse, but simply because the frame was completely different. It's different to build an NGO, and different story building an NGO, a different story trying to reform a government institution. So I think it's important to be critical. And the last thing, don't forget that things are irreversible. And some restoration is always possible. Look on Hungary today, and look on Macedonia. Our neighbor between Bulgaria and Albania is Macedonia, a country which is living very dark days. A journalist is in prison, and Mr. Gruevski is controlling media with an iron hand, unfortunately. And no one thought 15 years ago that things will go like this in Macedonia, Croatia, and in Hungary, but it happens. I will stop here because I was too long.
Great,
Thank you.
You were so punctual, really, admirations. Well, I think that what Remzi Lani said should be used by the European Commission in its approach on media environment. Probably you know that the European Commission has started paying attention on the health care of the media environment in the countries from the Western Balkans region. And this is a huge challenge for the European Union and for these countries for that matter. So I would really recommend that you read the progress reports of the European Commission, especially in the parts that are related to media. And if you recognize something very similar that is taking place in your country, that could be provide a good guideline what went wrong and what needs to be repaired. Mr. Lani actually touched quite for a short time the role of the social media, but I think that in Egypt, which our next speaker will speak about, we had a lot of expectations and maybe illusions about the role of the social media in provoking the revolution, instigating it. So it would be really interesting what Lina, Attalah, and I beg you excuse my pronunciation of your names beforehand. So what do you think about, are we right in considering the role of social media that instigated or just was a tool for the revolutions in your country?
I think it's not surprising that this question has been asked for the last 3 years, and we were always in a position to have to answer with a yes or a no and try to elaborate. But I really don't like the question, and I think it comes with this binary of how did social media operate as opposed to mainstream media, for example. Just as much as we have been asking whether online activism has been better than offline activism in making this revolution happen. And then what I really think is at stake is a particular dynamic that happened between these two worlds that constructed this certain influence at a particular time in the Egyptian political space. So, for example, before the revolution, a few years before the revolution, we are always in a situation whereby social media or citizen journalists through social media would basically force us, those of us who are working in mainstream media, to higher the ceiling of the freedoms of the things we cover just because they cover them themselves. So they sort of emboldened us to do things that we wouldn't do normally. At the same time, we would always be in a position whereby we are amplifying what they are doing because of our networks and our infrastructure. So it was always an ongoing situation of working together, a certain dynamic that is unfortunately not talked about in this context of always asking whether social media was useful or not. And I think the same thing applies to offline and online activism. The most popular or prominent digital activists in a context of Egypt, for example, happen to be those who have a very strong offline presence, those who, who organize on the street, who are present in protests, and so on and so forth. I think the more poignant question is really to ask what these dynamics have really done for the condition of political organizing in general, and how did they challenge or unsettle the traditional notion of tanzim, of political organization in this part of the world, right? And I'm not a scientist. I leave it to the scientists to diagnose what was the effect of this, but my initial sense is that these spaces have created certain individualities that the traditional tanzim or political in the form of political parties, in the form of organized politics, didn't leave people with. And I think this individuality is very important. This individuality that leads you to express yourself freely outside the scope of institutional restrictions. All of these are really important characteristics of the experience of social media and online activism in the context of the Egyptian revolution, and I would say Arab revolutions in general. The more, I think, also urgent question right now is the extent to which this dynamic between social media or new media and mainstream traditional media have really left us with an improved media environment right now, and this is not the case, unfortunately. I think it's no surprise to a lot of people who are following the situation in Egypt to know that the level of precarity that the Egyptian media have reached nowadays is unprecedented. And I say this from a professional perspective. It's not really out of political belief or anything like that. And I think this is due to how the ecosystem has functioned for the last decade or so, ever since media in Egypt has liberalized a little bit and has ceased to become just state media. So in the early 2000s, we faced the experience of private media, privately owned media coming to the scene and liberalizing the discourse a bit, tackling things that we wouldn't have tackled before that were quite threatening to the regime. But all of this was done within a parameter of certain dynamic, again, between the media entrepreneurs behind these private media and the Mubarak regime. So basically, we are going to own these media as power relics or as a way to pressure the regime to do certain concessions to us in our businesses, right? So this was the dynamic during the Mubarak era, but also, it was a consequential result of this dynamic is that these media, in fact, managed to create a situation of relative free expression to the one before. So in many ways, media played a role as civil society back then. But then when the Islamists came, when the Muslim Brotherhood came, we were in a situation where this dynamic could not be renewed. These media entrepreneurs could not preserve a certain relationship with the Morsi regime, which always looked at these media as threats to them, as faces of the old regime that are out and looking for their destabilization, and hence there was every way by the Muslim Brotherhood regime to basically limit the freedoms of these media from, interrogating journalists to, intimidating them in different ways and so on and so forth. So we naturally found these private media standing robustly against the Muslim Brotherhood regime around the 30 June revolution and basically becoming the self-appointed PR machines of the military regime. So right now we're left with this. We're left with a situation where all media, state media and privately owned media, are acting as PR machines for the military regime. They have lost the raison d'etre of their existence, really. And of course, in this context, the casualty is the truth, is proper journalism, is proper media.
And transformation for that matter.
And transformation for that matter. So we are in a dire need for a different voice right now. We are trying to do that, but also in a context of polarization, of extreme polarization that is highly engineered by the current military regime. It's very hard to do that. And then to address the final question, initial question of this panel, the question of regulation. Egypt is talking actively about regulation right now in the context of the constitution writing process, and it is, I find it very disheartening because this is not a proper context to talk about regulation. When you have extreme polarization, when you have active silencing of voices that are deemed to stand against the current pro-military regime, then the talk about regulation becomes extremely dangerous. It becomes actually in many ways synonymous to censorship. And I think before we talk about regulation, we need to have the right balances as manifested in having a proper freedom of information law, proper media laws, and so on and so forth. And then we can start talking about media regulation of the audiovisual media, of the print media. And also we have to ask who is talking about regulation. Is it media professionals, or is it military men who are basically concerned with national security, for example, those imagined terms that have never been unpacked up until now since the 1960s. So I think there are so many things that need to be done before we are confident enough to talk about regulation, and before we're confident enough to talk about regulation that wouldn't be synonymous with censorship. And I would stop there.
Yeah, I think that we should move forward to Zied el-Heni, who is a journalist and blogger in Tunisia, another country in transformation. Would you agree with Lina? do you find similarities maybe with Remzi as well? Anything different?
Yes, of course, there are similarities and there are differences between the three cases. But excuse me, please, my intervention will be in Arabic. So would you kindly put your translation في نهاية ساعات. Okay. قبل Can I start? Yeah. هناك 3 ملاحظات كيف تم إجبار الرئيس الأسبق زين العابدين بن علي على مغادرة البلاد وبالتالي مغادرة السلطة يوم 14 جانفي 2011. لا نعرف حقيقة ما هو دور القوى الخفية بين الظفرين التي حققت هذا الهدف. والملاحظة الثالثة هي أن في تونس اليوم توجد تجربة تمتلك كل مقومات النجاح، ونجاح هذه التجربة سوف لن ينعكس فقط إيجابيا على تونس، وإنما سينعكس إيجابيا على كامل محيطها، لسبب بسيط، هو أن في هذا المحيط ذي الخصوصية الحضارية والثقافية هناك قابلية للتفاعل والأخذ بالنماذج الناجحة عندما تكون من نفس المنظومة، خلافا ربما للنماذج التي توجد خارج هذه المنظومة حتى وإن كانت نماذج ناجحة. ورأينا كيف أنه حال سقوط رأس النظام في تونس، وهنا لا أتحدث عن سقوط النظام، سقوط رأس النظام في تونس، ونجاح شعار الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام، كيف أن الاستجابة كانت فورية في المحيط المباشر لتونس وحتى في المحيط الأبعد، بما في ذلك بعض الدول الإفريقية مثل أوغندا التي خرج فيها الناس رافعين نفس الشعار. فيما يتعلق بسؤالك، ألاحظ أن شبكات التواصل الاجتماعي، ويمكن أن نطلق الاسم على إطار أوسع وهو وسائل الاتصال والإعلام الجديد، كان لها دور أساسي في حشد الناس وجعلهم ينخرطون بقوة في الحراك الذي أدى إلى التغيير الذي عرفته بلادنا. فهناك شبان في تونس كانوا يقومون بتصوير تلك التحركات التي الرافضة وتلك الانتفاضة، كانوا يصورون مشاهد القتل وكانوا ينشرونها على الانترنت، ثم كانت هناك وسائل إعلام فضائيات تأخذ هذه المادة وتعيد بثها لتدخلها في كل البيوت.